maps. When I first entered the Army, I was told it is a graphic representation of a portion of the Earth's surface as drawn to scale as seen from above. That's what it is according to Army doctrine. It is among the first things I learned when I began training as what they call a geospatial engineer. It's what military map makers are officially known as at the moment. Name occasionally changes depending on the administration or whoever's writing the doctrine. It's also among these first things that I learned that it's actually patently false, an absurd understanding for us as mapping experts. What we learned is that a map is a tactical decision aid that we create for commanders in order for them to make the important decisions about where to mobilize soldiers or where to send supplies, and that we could take certain liberties with the display of geospatial information. So you might be curious what this experience, how the Army describes mapping, has to do with today's themes of hospitality and home. It is in this adaptive understanding of maps that I want to speak about today. For many of us, the concept of home, or at least a place where we feel most at ease, cannot be found using a standard map, as I frequently heard while I was serving on active duty in Hawaii and in Tacoma, Washington. Indigenous individuals likely have had their ancestral home altered in such a way that its depiction can vary from source to source, which makes our journey all the more tedious. A person who has been ostracized for their sexual identity cannot say, "Hey Siri, how do I get home right now?" Like many restless children who yearn for something different, I sought to find a new place to call home. Toward the end of high school, I wandered through the counselor's office area and I found shelves filled with maps that I needed for my next journey. And no, these were not the Rand McNally's that you might pick up at a convenience store when you're lost, nor were they copies of Rick Steves that you find at the nearest bookstore when you're planning that family vacation to Italy. These were college bulletins. See, I went to high school right as the internet was transitioning to what they call Web 2.0. So these college bulletins that I'm referring to were the hard copy bulletins that they physically shipped from admissions departments to high schools and prospective students. And they were not just the school's handbook, but they also contained information about the places that you would be spending the next 4, 5, however many years. Now, many caught my eye, but the one that stood out to me led me to a small liberal arts college in Washington State. The university president at the time had developed a pseudo-celebrity status with a following that I can only describe as somewhat cult-like. I'm part of that cult. Among the things that he was known for, he had a speech about how college is a home that he gave to every incoming class during his 13 years. And I believe that was probably the most memorable thing. The university even went so far as to create home shirts that had his picture above it in the style of the Obama Hope poster when they announced that he was retiring. As I sat in that small football stadium bleachers with my classmates to be, we listened as he told us that the university was a home that we had chosen. Being the good former English professor, he spoke about how many of us will leave with feelings of nostalgia. It's a word that he explained meant to return home and came to us from ancient Greek. It was a place that many of us, in spite of any obstacles, found hospitable. In some form or fashion, would return many years later. When it came time for me to leave Oahu for my next duty station, I was overjoyed to return to Tacoma because I thought of it as my home. For others, a map comes maybe in the form of a recipe. We can think of it kind of like the recipe for your mom's meatloaf, or even your favorite holiday cookie recipe, drawing you back into your childhood memories, your thought forgotten in order, to make room for those algebra equations you don't really use anymore. Now, I know sometimes when I walk through a book festival, I mean, what better place to find books and maps? It's my thing. I'll see a small box of old index cards and immediately be reminded of the tin box that my dad kept in the kitchen. And it was filled with recipes on those index cards. And I'm fairly certain that the patina that they had was actually caused by decades of baking grease and not the natural foxing process that paper undergoes. And I'm immediately brought back to our mobile home that we lived in while I was in high school, thinking about stuffed mushrooms that I avoided and stuffed peppers that I devoured by the bushel. My mouth is currently actually aching from thinking about a recipe that we called Mrs. Eisenhower's $1 Million Fudge. It's amazing, but the sweetness is just overbearing, and yet I cannot get enough of it. There is something life-giving about food. And I don't simply mean the fact that we are consuming a fuel that our body needs to operate. There is some legitimacy to the sayings and maxims that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. What is one of the first things that we wonder about when we plan an event? Usually it's food. Regardless of culture, we humans have linked food to hospitality in a way that we will never be able to undo. And when I say that recipes can be a map, I want you to take a moment to think about different types of food that you have seen, or even some that you have experienced. Many foods have gained a global reach thanks to commerce and tourism, but they can all be tied back to a place where they were first served. For instance, I think of Seattle's International District with my college housemates, or even date nights at Ala Moana Mall when someone mentions ramen. But ramen is a Japanese variation of a Chinese dish. When somebody mentions lomi lomi salmon, my mind immediately jumps to luau's and island life. But as I learned from an alumnus on one of his visits to Island, everything that goes into lomi lomi salmon, from the onions to the salmon, had at one point been imported, and none of it actually originates from Island. So at this point, you have some inclination of what maps and recipes or salmon and ramen have to do with our themes of hospitality and home, but there's something missing. Well, today we heard a story about fry bread. If the opportunity should present itself, I encourage you to pick up a copy of the book and read it in its entirety. After the story that was shared and the recipe that we saw from the author, it journeys even deeper into each of the elements that the story was broken down into. The concept of mixing flour or some type of ground meal with salt and water and then frying it is not unique to indigenous cultures. But for many of us, there is a particular resonance that arises when we hear fry bread. All I can think of is family, both the family that I had the opportunity to engage with, as well as the family that I was cut off from. It comes in different shapes and colors. Its recipe varies from community to community. So how my Oyanke, my community, my family, makes fry bread is completely different from what my friend's family did to make theirs. And I am emphasizing family and hospitality and its connection to food at this point in the year because it's November. What do we think of when we think of November? Turkey, family, community. These things that some of us have journeyed far away from and are cut off from. It's not undifferent from the reservation life that some of my family members experienced, that I was cut off from growing up in Texas. All of us have a different map that we use to journey through life. And sometimes we are cut off from what is hospitable. Food can be a type of map that we get to partake in. And in it, we can remember the ways back home. We can remember the obstacles, and we can also remember the shortcuts. It is not only a source of some of our heartaches, but the things that fill our hearts. And with this, Nunjwe and blessings be